A pink rabbit father loses his job, then loses his ability to do almost anything else, and the family adapts to him as if he were weather. That is the plot of dozens of late-season Amazing World of Gumball episodes, but it is also the shape of a particular kind of decay that happens to long-running animated comedies. The technical name for that decay is Flanderisation. The term comes from The Simpsons, from the slow transformation of Ned Flanders from a polite Christian neighbor into a one-note evangelical caricature, and it describes the process by which a character's most prominent trait gets exaggerated over a series until that trait eclipses the rest of who they were. Once you start looking for it, you find it everywhere. You find it in Patrick Star going from a slow-witted but loyal friend to a creature of pure id. You find it in Joey Tribbiani going from a charming actor to a man who cannot grasp the concept of sharing food. You find it in Homer Simpson himself, in Peter Griffin, in Stan Smith, in nearly every character whose voice actor has been in the booth for more than 100 episodes. The Amazing World of Gumball ran for 6 seasons between 2011 and 2019. And across those 6 seasons, every single one of its core characters underwent some form of Flanderization. Richard, Tobias, Mr. Small, Banana Joe, Sussy, Hector, Anais, Penny, even smaller figures like Sarah Gelato and Bobert. The show leaned harder and harder on the trait that worked best, the joke that landed reliably, the angle the writers could trust. That alone would not be unusual. Every long-running animated show eventually does this. But Gumball is also a show with an unusual amount of meta-awareness about itself, and tracking the Flanderization across its run reveals something about what its writers thought was reliably funny, what they thought the audience came back for, and where they decided the line between exaggeration and parody actually sits. Welcome to Cortoon. Get comfortable. This one goes deep. Let us get into it. To understand Flanderization in Gumball, the easiest place to start is with a character whose original version is barely remembered at all. Tobias Wilson, the multicolored rainbow-haired son of Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, voiced for the bulk of the show's run by Hugo Harold Harrison, first appears in the very first season as a peripheral classmate. He shows up in episodes like The Pressure, which aired on the 8th of June 2012, and The Dream, which aired earlier the same season, and in those early appearances, Tobias is something specific. He is a rich kid. He has a large house, he has older sisters, he has the kind of money that means his family takes vacations Gumball's family cannot afford. He is also, crucially, sincere. In The Pressure, when Gumball is trying to figure out how to ask Penny to hold his hand, Tobias offers genuine, if misguided, advice. He wants to be cool, but he is not cool, and the early seasons mine that gap for honest, almost tender comedy. He is the kid who has heard about all the things popular boys are supposed to like and tries to perform them without ever quite landing the trick. His haircut, which mimics his father's, is itself a small visual gag about a child copying adult behavior without understanding it. The early Tobias is also, in a way that the late character cannot be, a foil for Gumball that does not exist purely to embarrass him. In The Pressure, the gym scene is arranged so that Tobias is the first person Gumball turns to when the social pressure of holding a girl's hand becomes more than he can carry alone. The script lets Tobias offer his advice with the conviction of a child who genuinely believes he is being useful. The advice is bad. The advice involves elaborate physical maneuvers and unnecessary props. But the framing of the scene is not that Tobias is a fool. The framing is that Tobias is a friend. The comedy arrives because the friendship is sincere and the competence is absent. And those two elements together produce a particular kind of warmth that the show is willing to extend to a minor character. The audience is invited to like Tobias, even as the audience is invited to laugh at him. That dual invitation is the marker of a character who is being treated as a person. Compare that with the Tobias who appears in late-season ensemble shots, a character whose every entry is choreographed around the same beat. In late-season classroom scenes, Tobias is part of a wider crowd where his role is to hold a single posture and deliver a single attitude. The script does not ask him to want anything. The script does not ask him to advise anyone. The script asks him to occupy the visual slot of the kid who is performing coolness, and the script trusts that the audience will read the slot without further setup. The character has been resolved into his costume, the hair is the same, the bare chest is the same. The interior, however, is no longer present in the writing. The character has been reduced to the set of physical signals that the audience already knows how to read. By the middle of the 3rd season, that sincerity is already eroding. By the 4th and 5th seasons, Tobias has been reduced to a single function. He is the wannabe. He is the pose. He's the boy who shows up in any background gag wearing sunglasses indoors, throwing up hand signs, performing a hip-hop persona he has assembled from incomplete information. the episodes start using him as a shorthand for trying too hard. In late-season ensemble shots, you can identify Tobias instantly because the writers have given him a uniform of cool that he wears in nearly every scene. The colors stay the same. The rainbow hair, the bare chest, the shorts, but the inner life, the tentative reaching, the small hopeful awkwardness, has been sanded off. He is no longer a kid trying to be cool. He is the show's permanent placeholder for a kid trying to be cool, which is a different thing entirely. The gap between those two Tobiases is not enormous in screen time, because Tobias was never a lead, but it is sharp. The early Tobias has a scene in The Pressure where he genuinely believes he is helping Gumball, and the comedy lands because his confidence is misplaced rather than performed. The late Tobias has scenes where the joke is simply that he is Tobias, and that being Tobias means doing the cool thing badly. The character has stopped reaching. The character has arrived at his function, and once a character has arrived at their function, the writers can place them anywhere in a scene and trust the audience to read the joke without setup. That is the goal of Flanderisation, when it works. It is also, in the long run, what kills a character's capacity to surprise you. The plain statement of the late Tobias is this: a child who once had the structural feature of a hopeful but incompetent reach has been written into a child who only has the structural feature of a costume. The reach is gone. The hope is gone. The incompetence is still there, but it has nothing left to fail at, because the character is no longer trying. What the show traded for the easier laugh was the ability to write Tobias into a scene where he could have a small emotional movement. The reliability of his function as background color was bought at the cost of his ability to be the focus of his own subplot. He is now too thin to carry one. The thinning was gradual, and the audience was unlikely to notice it episode by episode. But the cumulative effect is that the Tobias who once asked Gumball if he could come along on adventures is no longer a character the writers can plausibly send on an adventure of his own. The reason Tobias is the easiest place to start is that almost no one in the audience minds. He was never the heart of the show. Reducing him to a function did not cost the show much because the show was not asking him to carry weight. But the same process happens in larger and more consequential ways to characters who started out carrying weight. And the next clearest example of that is the yellow fruit who became the show's all-purpose mouthpiece for an annoying friend. Banana Joe, voiced by Sandra Dickinson and later by other performers depending on the season, is one of the original Elmore Junior High students. He appears across the very first run of episodes in the spring of 2011, including The Crew, which aired on the 29th of June 2011, and which is the closest thing the early show has to a manifesto on his character. In The Crew, Gumball and Darwin try to recruit Banana Joe into their gang of cool kids. And the episode systematically establishes that Banana Joe is a banana with a quirky, slightly off personality. He laughs at his own jokes. He tells jokes that are not quite jokes. He is a banana, which is funny on its face, and his laughter is structured in a way that makes other characters uncomfortable, which is funny on a second pass. But the early Banana Joe is not pure annoyance. He has a friendship with Gumball and Darwin that the show treats with some warmth. He has parents who appear in the background. He exists in a social fabric that the show is building. The opening minutes of The Crew arrange Banana Joe as a child whose comedic instinct is sincere even when it lands badly. He performs his banana-themed jokes with the conviction of a child who has rehearsed them in front of a mirror. The episode allows the audience to watch him deliver a Peel-related pun, and then wait, with an open and hopeful expression, for the laugh that does not come. That hope is the load-bearing element. The early Banana Joe wants to be funny. He wants other children to find him funny. The fact that other children do not always find him funny is the source of the show's comedy. But the wanting is treated as real. He is not merely a noise generator. He is a child whose self-image as a comedian is at stake in every interaction. And when the audience watches him fail, the failure has a small ache to it because the wanting was sincere. By the fourth season, Banana Joe's function has shifted. He becomes the prankster. He becomes the boy whose primary comedic verb is interruption. In The Pizza, which aired on the 17th of November 2016, in the show's fourth season, Banana Joe is the figure who most aggressively pushes Gumball into a confrontation with Larry, the long-suffering employee of dozens of Elmore service jobs. By the fifth season, the writers have started using Banana Joe as a kind of Greek chorus for irritation. He shows up in school scenes specifically to deliver the line that breaks Gumball's patience. He is not just a banana with a quirky personality anymore. He is the banana who exists to puncture other people's seriousness, often by way of a joke that is bad on purpose. The Bumpkin, which aired on the 23rd of June, 2016, late in the show's run, leans into a version of Banana Joe whose entire emotional palette is performative annoyance. The plain statement of the late Banana Joe is that he has become a delivery system for irritation aimed at other characters. In a late season scene from The Bumpkin, Banana Joe enters a moment of relative calm and produces a remark that exists for the express purpose of breaking the calm. The remark is not in service of his own comedic ambition. The remark is in service of the show's structural need for a beat that resets the tone. The character is being used as a mechanism, and the mechanism does not require him to want anything beyond the production of the disruptive line. The early Banana Joe would have wanted the line to land. The late Banana Joe wants only to produce the line. The difference is small in the moment and enormous across a season. What the show traded for the reliability of his disruption was the small ache of his early failures, which were funny precisely because the audience could feel his disappointment. There is a behavioral read worth doing here. The early Banana Joe makes his own jokes and finds them funny. The late Banana Joe makes his jokes and waits for other people to react badly. That is a small change in writing intention, but it changes the character entirely. The early Banana Joe is a child who is genuinely amused by the world. The late Banana Joe is a child who is performing amusement to provoke a reaction. The first version is a person. The second version is a comedy mechanism. Both can be funny, but only one of them can be sad. And the show stops being able to make Banana Joe sad somewhere in the third or fourth season. After that point, when the writers want a sad character, they reach for someone else. Banana Joe's Flanderisation is interesting because it tracks a particular shift in what Gumball thought it was. The early show is a slice-of-life comedy about a strange family in a strange town. The late show is a slice-of-life comedy about a strange family in a strange town that has also become aware of itself as a comedy. Banana Joe's late-period role as the boy who exists to be bad on purpose is partly a function of the show needing characters who can step outside the action and comment on it. He becomes the comedy mechanism because the show needs comedy mechanisms in a way it did not in the first season. That is a structural reason for Flanderisation, and it is one that comes up again and again as the analysis moves through the cast. There is a further consideration that applies specifically to Banana Joe and to the show's relationship with sincere comedic ambition. In the very early episodes, Banana Joe's father, also a banana, appears with him in family-coded backgrounds, and the family unit is given the same kind of structural respect the show extends to the Wattersons and the Fitzgeralds. By the late seasons, Banana Joe's family appears less, and when it does appear, the family is also Flanderized, with his father becoming a one-note straight man whose only role is to react to his son's escalating prank energy. The family ecosystem that the early show built has been pruned, and Banana Joe stands more and more as a single figure rather than as a member of a household. The character is more isolated in late-period appearances than he was in the first season, and the isolation contributes to the flatness. A character with a family is harder to flatten than a character who is alone in the frame. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next character whose Flanderization is worth examining is one whose original version contained genuine, unironic insight, and whose late version became one of the show's most reliable embarrassments. Mr. Steve Small, the school counselor at Elmore Junior High, voiced for most of the show's run by Lewis McLeod, first appears in the second season. His early appearances establish him as a hippie. He is a man with long hair, a peace sign aesthetic, and a vocabulary of vaguely spiritual phrases. The early seasons play him as a well-meaning if slightly out-of-touch counselor, the kind of school employee who has read a lot of books about feelings and tries to apply them sometimes successfully and sometimes not. In his earliest scenes, he is allowed moments of actual insight. He listens. He asks the kids what is bothering them. He delivers, on occasion, a piece of advice that turns out to be useful, even if his delivery is goofy. The episode that breaks Mr. Small open and changes him forever is The Stink, which aired on the 25th of October 2012 in the show's second season. In that episode, Mr. Small's home is revealed, and the home is a disaster. Trash everywhere, empty wrappers, the visible evidence of a man who counsels children to live mindfully and consume responsibly while himself living in chaos. The reveal is funny. It is also load-bearing. After The Stink, Mr. Small can never again be a sincere counselor without the audience remembering that he is a hypocrite. The show has, in a single episode, given itself permission to use Mr. Small for hypocrisy jokes forever. The setup of The Stink is unusually deliberate for a second season episode. The episode begins with Mr. Small in his counselor role, dispensing the kind of mild, well-intentioned guidance the character had been associated with up to that point. The audience is allowed to settle into the familiar version of the character. The pivot occurs when the camera follows him home, and the home is revealed to contradict every word he has spoken in the office. garbage, stale food, the squalor of a man who does not practice what he preaches. The show makes the contradiction visual, which is the most efficient way to make a contradiction permanent. Once a contradiction has been visualized, the audience cannot unsee it, and the writers cannot unwrite it. From that episode onward, the character is locked. The plain statement of the stink is that the show identified a single contradiction and decided that the contradiction was more useful than the original sincerity. The trade was made in a single episode, and the character paid for it across the next 4 seasons. And that is what happens. From the 3rd season onward, Mr. Small's appearances are almost entirely structured around the gap between what he says and what he does. He preaches environmentalism while his own consumption is grotesque. He preaches calm while panicking. He preaches openness to new experience while flinching from anything actually new. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the character has become a pure hypocrisy machine. The original sincerity, the original insight, the original moments where his goofiness coexisted with genuine kindness have all been stripped away. What remains is a man whose only function is to say one thing and do another. The character has been flattened into his contradiction. There is a specific anchor worth naming for the late Mr. Small. In episodes like The Outside, which aired on the 11th of November 2015, and in his appearances throughout the 5th season, the writers do not even bother to set up the contradiction anymore. The audience is expected to know that whatever Mr. Small says, the truth is the opposite. The setup is gone. Only the punchline remains. That is a hallmark of late-stage Flanderisation. The character has become so reliable in their function that the show does not need to do the work of establishing the joke. The joke is the character. The character is the joke. In The Outside, Mr. Small's role is structured around his fear of the world beyond the comfortable bubble he has built for himself. The character is presented as a man whose entire stated philosophy is built on openness and exploration, and the episode systematically demonstrates that he is, in practice, terrified of any actual encounter with anything outside his immediate comfort. The joke is well constructed. The joke is also entirely dependent on the audience having absorbed years of prior Mr. Small contradictions. A first-time viewer would not have the context to find the joke as funny as a 6th season viewer would, because the joke is built on the accumulated weight of the character's Flanderisation. The show has trained the audience to expect the contradiction, and the joke pays out only because the training has been completed. The character has become a coupon that the show redeems whenever it needs the laugh. There is a reframe to do here, though. Mr. Small's Flanderisation, more than most, was structurally invited by the show itself. The hippie counselor character is in cultural shorthand already a figure of comedic tension between sincere ideals and unsincere practice. The show did not invent the hypocritical hippie, it inherited it. What Gumball did was push that inherited template to its logical extreme. By the end of the show's run, Mr. Small is a kind of total hypocrite, a man who not only fails to live up to his ideals, but seems to actively oppose them whenever the camera is on him. The character has become a parody of a parody, which is the kind of thing Gumball does well, but which also closes off the possibility of any other reading of the character. Compare the late Mr. Small with his appearance in episodes like The Helmet, where he is briefly allowed to be a real adult with real concerns about Gumball's safety, or in The Date, where his counseling instincts, while still goofy, are not entirely useless. Those moments stop appearing somewhere around the 3rd season. By the 5th, they are gone. The character has been emptied out and refilled with his own contradiction, and the show has decided that this is funnier and more useful than the original. The accumulation of hypocrisy gags makes any sincere Mr. Small scene feel like a mistake. The audience has been trained, the trick has done its work. There is one more angle worth taking on Mr. Small before moving on. His voice, his posture, his entire physical performance never changes. The animators do not give him a different walk in late seasons. The voice actor does not push him into a different register. What changes is the scaffolding around him, the situations the writers put him into, the kind of jokes he is allowed to land. The character himself is the same model. The Flanderisation happens in the writing, not in the performance. That is true of most of the cases the rest of this analysis will touch. But it is especially clean in Mr. Small. He is the same drawing in Season 1 and Season 6. Only the words coming out of his mouth and the situations those words are placed in have changed. That is a useful clarifying detail because it locates the Flanderisation precisely where it actually happens, which is in the script. What the show traded for the reliability of Mr. Small's hypocrisy was the possibility of an adult mentor figure inside Elmore Junior High. The early character could plausibly have been called on for guidance during emotional storylines, and the writers occasionally did call on him. The late character cannot be called on without the call collapsing into joke territory. There is no longer an adult inside the school whose stated emotional vocabulary the show is willing to take seriously. The principal is a corrupt figure of authority. Miss Simeon is a hostile teacher. The other adults are background. Mr. Small was the only adult on staff whose entire job description was emotional support, and the show Flanderized him to the point where the job description became a setup for a joke, rather than a function the character could perform. The school lost its counselor in exchange for a more reliable laugh. The fourth case is heavier than the first three because it concerns the character who is closest to being the emotional center of the family that holds the show together. Richard Watterson, the pink rabbit father of the Watterson household, voiced for the entire run by Dan Russell, is in many ways the most Flanderized character in the show. His early version contains things that by the end are almost unrecognizable. His late version has become a kind of household appliance, a creature whose only registered states are hungry, asleep, or panicking. Tracking what was lost is one of the saddest exercises a Gumball viewer can do. In the very first season, Richard is presented as cheerful and somewhat dim, but also as functional in specific ways. The Spoon, which aired on the 25th of August, 2011, late in the first season, gives Richard a small but real arc. He is shown to have his own emotional life, his own relationships outside the family, his own sense of what kind of father he wants to be. The Authority, which aired on the 7th of August 2014, in the second season, places Richard in a position where he has to enforce rules, and he does so with surprising competence, even if the show frames his competence comedically. The Job, which aired on the 28th of August 2014, also in the second season, is the episode that in retrospect marks both the high point and the beginning of the end of Richard as a fully functional character. In The Job, Richard gets a job as a pizza delivery driver, performs at it with a kind of inspired enthusiasm, and is then fired in a way that the show treats as cosmically unjust. The episode ends with the explicit narrative that the universe itself does not want Richard to be employed. That is a structural choice. Once the show decides that Richard cannot have a job, it is decided that he cannot have a particular kind of competence. And once it has decided that, the door is open for every subsequent episode to lean further into his incapacity. The early Richard of the Spoon is a character with a pre-show life that the episode is willing to honor. The episode places Richard in proximity to a friend from his past, and the proximity is treated with the same care the show would extend to one of Gumball's friendships. Richard remembers things. Richard has emotional reactions to remembering things. Richard is allowed to be moved by the encounter in a way that the late character cannot be moved by anything other than food. The plain statement of the Spoon is that Richard had a life before the family, and that life mattered to him, and the show was willing to give the audience access to it. By the late seasons, the access has been closed. Richard's pre-family life is no longer a subject the show is willing to enter. The character has been reduced to his current household function, and his history has been amputated to make the reduction cleaner. The Job is even more painful in retrospect. The early scenes of the episode show Richard discovering that he has a competence. The pizza delivery work suits him. The episode allows the audience to watch him take pride in the work, and the pride is treated as real. There is a montage in which Richard performs the delivery with skill, and the animation choices around the montage are warm rather than mocking. The episode could have ended with Richard keeping the job. Instead, the episode invents a cosmic-level intervention that strips the job from him, and the intervention is framed not as a coincidence, but as a structural feature of the universe the show is set in. That framing is the moment the show decides what Richard is for. He is for incompetence. The episode that taught the audience he was capable is the same episode that decided his capability was a bug rather than a feature. By the fourth season, Richard's incompetence has become not just a character trait, but a plot driver. Episodes are built around what Richard cannot do. He cannot read instructions, he cannot operate basic technology, he cannot remember the names of his own children consistently. His food obsession, which in early seasons was a quirk among many quirks, becomes the load-bearing trait that the writers use to motivate his behavior in nearly every scene. He moves through episodes pulled by the gravity of food the way a planet is pulled by a star. Episodes like The Schooling, The Stories, and many of the late-season Richard-centric installments structure Richard's whole emotional landscape around eating, sleeping, and a kind of generalized inability to participate in adult life. The behavioral read on early Richard versus late Richard is stark. Early Richard, when faced with a problem, sometimes solves it. He may solve it badly, he may solve it in a way that creates a new problem, but he engages. He has a sense of himself as a person with agency. Late Richard, when faced with a problem, eats, or sleeps, or runs away from it in a way that the show frames as itself the joke. The agency has been removed. The character has been reduced to his appetites. And because Richard is the father, because he is structurally responsible for the family, The show has to do a kind of architectural work to compensate. Anais becomes more and more the household's effective adult. Nicole becomes more and more the household's only working parent. Gumball and Darwin, who in early seasons could turn to Richard for the occasional moment of misguided but real fatherly guidance, in late seasons turn to him only as a comedy generator. The accumulation matters. Across 6 seasons, the audience watches Richard fail to do specific things. Fail to drive, fail to hold down work, fail to read a basic document, fail to remember a birthday, fail to recognize his own children in disguise. Each failure individually is funny. Stacked together, they create a portrait of a man who, by the end of the series, would not be able to live alone. The show never directly addresses this. It cannot. The premise of the family requires Richard to be the father. But the cumulative weight of every Richard-centric episode in seasons 4 through 6 is a portrait of a person who, in any realistic sense, could not function. Nicole's exhaustion across the series is partly maternal exhaustion, and partly the exhaustion of being married to a man whose Flanderisation has reached the point of total dependency. There is a specific anchor for the moment Richard's Flanderisation crosses a line. In the 5th season, in episodes that build around his food obsession, the show begins to use his eating as not merely a quirk, but as a horror element. He devours. He consumes in a way that is animated to be alarming. The show is making the joke explicit that Richard's hunger is not normal hunger, that it is a kind of need that has detached from normal human scale. That is a Flanderisation move. The original Richard ate too much because he was a happy man who liked food. The late Richard eats too much because the show has made his eating into the engine of his character. The cause has been replaced by the effect. The trait has eaten the person. There is a contrast worth drawing here with the early season Richard who appears in The Spoon. In that episode, Richard has a relationship with an old friend, a relationship that the show treats with real emotional weight. He has a history. He has people he cares about who exist outside the immediate family. He has, in short, an interior life. By the late seasons, those interior signals have largely disappeared. Richard's friendships with characters outside the family have either been written out or reduced to one-note gags. His past is invoked only when it can be played for absurdity. The character has been hollowed of his pre-show life. Whatever Richard was before he was a father, whatever he wanted, whatever he loved, has been pruned away to make room for the sleeping, eating, bumbling figure that fits cleanly into any episode the writers need to fill. The plain statement of late-period Richard is that he sits on the couch and the family moves around him. The image, repeated across late episodes, is of a body that has stopped needing to be the center of its own narrative. He is asleep more often than awake in many late episodes. When he is awake, he is reaching for food. When he is reaching for food, he is being narratively framed as a force of nature rather than as a person with a will. What the show traded for the reliable laugh of his appetite was the entire shape of the father he could have been. The early Richard could have grown over 6 seasons. The late Richard cannot grow because the show has given him no axis along which growth could occur. He has been resolved into a plateau. And the plateau is funny, and the plateau is also the end of the character as a character. There is a reframe to consider though, and it is important. Some of Richard's Flanderisation is, arguably, the consequence of the show's other Flanderizations. As Anais becomes the deadpan voice of reason, Richard has to become more chaotic to give her something to react to. As Nicole's exhaustion becomes a recurring engine, Richard has to become more incompetent to justify her exhaustion. As the show's tonal palette becomes more absurd in later seasons, Richard's version of fatherhood has to become more absurd to keep up. The character is not Flanderized in a vacuum. He is Flanderized in relation to the rest of the cast, and his flattening serves the show's overall escalation. That does not make the loss less real, but it does locate the Flanderization in the context of a system, rather than as a single character-level decision. There is one more analytic layer to add to the Richard case, which is the question of whether the show ever pushes back against its own Flanderization. The answer is, there are late season episodes in which Richard is briefly allowed a moment of clarity, a moment of real fatherly instinct, a moment where the original Richard surfaces. Those moments are usually short, and they are usually framed as surprising, which is itself a marker of how thoroughly the Flanderization has set in. The show has trained its audience to expect Richard to be incompetent, and so any moment of competence reads as either an exception or a punchline. The Flanderization has become the baseline against which any other behavior has to define itself. That is the deepest stage of the process. The character's original self is now the deviation from the rule. The next case is one of the show's most quietly tragic, because it concerns a character whose original version was unusually rich for a sister sidekick figure, and whose late version had been reduced to a single tone. Anais Watterson, the 4-year-old rabbit daughter of Richard and Nicole, voiced for the entire show's run by Kyla Ray Kowaleski, is one of the most interesting cases in the entire cast. She begins the series as a version of the smart baby trope, the precocious younger sibling who is intellectually superior to everyone around her. That trope alone would not be unusual. Lisa Simpson, Stewie Griffin, Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory all shared that template. What Gumball did with Anais in early seasons was give her, alongside the precocity, a quiet emotional life that the show was willing to take seriously. The Genius, which aired on the 20th of November 2012 in the show's second season, is the foundational Anais-centric episode. In it, Anais' intelligence is tested at school, and the episode treats her not just as a comedy device, but as a child with feelings about being different. She is lonely. She wants to be understood. She wants her family to see her, and the show frames her wanting in a way that the audience is invited to feel for. The episode has a real emotional spine. Anais ends it not in triumph, but in a quieter, sadder place than she began. That kind of writing requires a character who can carry emotional weight, and the early season Anais is very much such a character. The structure of The Genius is worth retelling, because the structure itself is what the late seasons stopped building. The episode opens with Anais being tested, and the testing places her in an environment surrounded by other gifted children. The expectation set up by the opening is that Anais will find a community of people who understand her at a level her family cannot. The episode then complicates that expectation by showing that the gifted environment is not a place of belonging. It is a place of pressure. The other children are not friends. The instructors are not nurturers. Anais discovers that being recognized as exceptional comes with a cost, and the cost is loneliness. The episode lets that loneliness sit on screen for a beat that is unusually long for a children's show. The plain statement of The Genius is that intelligence does not solve the problem of needing to belong, and the episode trusts the audience to understand that the 4-year-old at its center is feeling that contradiction in her body. The writing requires the character to have an interior. The late seasons assume the interior is no longer present. By the 3rd and 4th seasons, the show has begun to use Anais primarily as a deadpan reaction shot. When something absurd is happening, the camera cuts to Anais, who delivers a flat, dry line that punctures the absurdity. That is a useful function. It is also a narrowing. The deadpan voice of reason is a job, and once a character is doing that job consistently, the other things they could be doing tend to fall away. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Anais' appearances are heavily weighted toward the role of the family's only sensible member. She rolls her eyes. She delivers the dry observation. She refuses to participate in whatever scheme her brothers and father have cooked up. She is, in the late show, something close to a Greek chorus. The cost of that narrowing is the loss of the lonely child from The Genius. The cost is the loss of the 4-year-old who needs her family to understand her. The late Anais does not need anything from her family. She's been positioned above them. She is the one who already understands. And her job in the comedy is to look upon her relatives with the patient resignation of a child who has accepted that she is the only adult in the house. That can be funny. It is also, in long stretches, a narrowing. The character has been promoted out of her own emotional need, and the promotion has cost her depth. There is an episode in the 4th season called The Sorcerer, which aired on the 2nd of June 2016, in which Anais is given a more substantial subplot, and the contrast with the early season Anais of The Genius is instructive. In The Sorcerer, Anais' intelligence is still on display, but her emotional vulnerability is largely absent. The show has decided that intelligence is what Anais brings to a scene. Vulnerability is what other characters bring. The labor has been divided, and Anais is no longer a character who can carry both at once. There is a specific anchor that captures the late Anais cleanly. In ensemble scenes across the 5th and 6th seasons, Anais is positioned in the frame in a particular way. She stands slightly apart. Her expression is fixed in a kind of patient irritation. The camera knows where she is, and it knows that her job is to be the one who is not buying what the rest of the family is selling. That positioning is itself a marker of Flanderisation. The character has a place. The character has a function. The character has been placed in the comedy machine, and the machine knows exactly where to find her when it needs her. That kind of reliability is what Flanderisation produces. It is also what Flanderisation costs. The behavioral read on early Anais versus late Anais reveals one specific change that is worth naming. Early Anais asks questions. She is curious about the world, about her family, about why the strange town she lives in works the way it does. Late Anais answers questions, or refuses to answer them, or rolls her eyes at the question being asked in the first place. She has stopped being curious. she has become the character who already knows. That shift from curious child to already knowing observer is one of the cleaner illustrations in the entire show of what Flanderisation does to a character's interior. It does not change them visually. It does not change their voice. It changes the verbs that the writers reach for when they have to put words in the character's mouth. The plain statement of late period Anais is that she has become the household's permanent rolling eye. Her face is set in a single expression for entire scenes, and the expression is an expression of being above the proceedings. What the show traded for that reliable expression was the access to the lonely child of the genius, the child who needed her family and could not always get what she needed. The late Anais cannot need anything from her family because the show has placed her structurally above them. She is the adult in miniature. She is the one whose role is to disapprove. The role is funny because it is performed by a 4-year-old, and the comedy of the disjunction never quite wears out. But the character whose interior was once visible has been replaced by a character whose interior is no longer the show's subject. The show kept the joke. The show lost the loneliness. There is a reframe worth offering on Anais, because her case is not entirely one of loss. The deadpan 4-year-old voice of reason is, in itself, one of the show's most stable comedic engines. The audience laughs at her every time. The writers can rely on her to land a joke. The character in her Flanderized form is doing useful work. The cost is internal to the character. The benefit is external to her, distributed across the show as a whole. That is often how Flanderization works in long-running comedies. The character pays. The show benefits. Whether the trade is worth it depends on whether you watch the show for the characters or for the comedy. Gumball, more than most animated comedies, has historically asked its audience to do both, and so the loss of depth in any one character feels more pointed than it might in a show that was only ever a joke delivery system. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fifth major case to examine is in some ways the inverse of all the others, and it is worth pausing on for that reason. Penny Fitzgerald, voiced first by Teresa Gallagher and then more permanently by Jessica McDonald, begins the series as the love interest archetype with one defining visual quirk. She is a peanut. Her shell defines her silhouette. Her hair, which is red and floating, sits above the shell as a small flame of personality. She is shy, sweet, kind, and she is largely defined in the early seasons by her relationship to Gumball, who has a crush on her. That is a thin character by the standards of any other show. By the standards of an animated comedy with a 30-character cast, it is a perfectly normal starting position for a love interest to be in. The episode that changes Penny forever is The Shell, which aired on the 11th of December, 2014, in the show's 3rd season. In The Shell, Penny removes her peanut shell, and the audience and Gumball both discover that underneath the shell is not another small peanut, but a shape-shifting creature capable of transforming into multiple forms. She becomes a fairy with antlers. She becomes a butterfly. She becomes various other forms across the rest of the series. The episode is one of the most emotionally serious the show ever produced, and it explicitly reframes Penny's character. The shell, the show says, was a constraint. It was something her family insisted on. It was something she had been told was who she was. Removing it is a coming-of-age moment, and it permanently alters who the character is allowed to be on screen. The structure of the shell deserves a closer pass. The episode opens with Gumball trying to take his relationship with Penny to a deeper level, and the attempt forces a conversation about the shell that Penny has worn since she was a child. The conversation is treated with a degree of tenderness that the show is not always willing to extend to its romantic subplot. Penny explains that her father insists on the shell, that her family considers the shell a kind of armor, that the shell is presented to her as protection rather than as constraint. The episode then asks Penny to choose, and Penny chooses to remove it. The removal is animated as an emergence rather than as a transformation. The shape-shifting forms are not new abilities Penny has acquired. They are abilities she always had, which the shell was preventing her from expressing. The plain statement of the shell is that a constraint imposed by family in the name of safety can be a cage, and that the act of leaving the cage is the act of becoming oneself. That is heavier material than animated comedies usually carry, and the show carries it without flinching. Penny is, after this episode, a character with a story rather than a character with a posture. The question worth asking is whether what happened to Penny after the shell is Flanderization or its opposite. The case for Flanderization is straightforward. After the shell, Penny has a defining trait, which is shapeshifting. She becomes the character who, when the show needs a transformation gag, transforms. She becomes the character who can express any emotional state by literally changing form. The writers reach for her shape-shifting whenever they need a specific kind of visual joke. That is, on one reading, exactly what Flanderisation looks like. The character has a thing she does, and the show uses the thing she does whenever it needs her to do something. The case against, though, is stronger. Before the shell, Penny had a defining visual that constrained her emotional palette. She could be sweet, she could be shy, she could be brave in small ways. She could not, in any obvious way, be terrifying. She could not be ecstatic. She could not be anything that the small peanut shell silhouette could not contain. After the shell, all of those registers open up. Penny becomes capable of being many things at once. She becomes a more complete character, not a less complete one. The transformation is not a flattening, it is an opening. That makes Penny one of the only major Gumball characters to undergo the opposite of Flanderisation. She is unflattened. The show takes a thin character and gives her depth, gives her possibility, gives her a story about agency and identity that is unusually mature for an animated comedy. The shape-shifting from this angle is not a quirk being exaggerated. It is a metaphor being made literal. Penny was always more than her shell. The show finally found a way to show it. There is, though, a complicating layer. After the shell, the show has to decide what to do with Penny on a regular basis, and the decisions it makes are not always equal to the depth the episode opened up. In the 4th and 5th seasons, Penny's appearances are often brief. She is Gumball's girlfriend, and the show treats her relationship with Gumball with care, but it does not always give Penny her own substantial subplots. The depth that the shell opened up is in practice only intermittently used. The character is allowed to be more than she was, but the show often does not have the bandwidth to show her being more. That is not Flanderisation exactly. It is something closer to underuse. The character has the room to be deep. The show does not always fill the room. The reframe is that Penny is the show's clearest counterexample to its own tendency toward Flanderisation. The writers are capable of doing the opposite. They are capable of taking a character and growing her instead of flattening her. The fact that they did it with Penny and not, for example, with Richard says something about what the show thought certain characters were for. Penny was the love interest. The show wanted to make her real. Richard was the funny dad. The show wanted to make him funnier. Those are different design instincts applied to different characters at different points in the show's run. And the difference is what the audience watches play out across 6 seasons. There is one more thing to say about Penny, which is that her case shows that Flanderisation is not inevitable. It is a choice. The writers chose to flatten Tobias. They chose to flatten Banana Joe. They chose to flatten Mr. Small. They chose to flatten Richard. They chose, with Penny, to do something different. That tells us that the Flanderizations elsewhere in the show were not a force of nature, but a series of decisions made for specific reasons in service of specific comedic and structural goals. The show could have done otherwise. With Penny, it did. With most others, it did not. Knowing that the choice exists is what makes the analysis of the choices the show actually made worth doing. The next character to examine occupies a smaller corner of the show, but is one of the most vivid examples of Flanderisation in the entire cast. Sussy, the chinned girl voiced by Aurélie Charbonnier, begins her run on the show as a piece of pure surreal comedy. Her early appearances, in episodes like The Pony, which aired on the 11th of October 2012, in the 2nd season, present her as a child whose presence is inexplicable in a way the show enjoys but does not explain. She has a chin that dominates her face. She moves in a jerky, puppet-like way that the animators clearly took pleasure in. She speaks in a distinctive cadence. She is funny because she is strange, and the early show is willing to let her be strange without apologizing for her or punishing her for it. The Pony is worth retelling because it gives the audience the original Sussy at her most fully realized. Anais, the more conventional protagonist of the episode, is given a pony, and the episode contrasts her conventional childhood desire with Sussy's unconventional approach to the same object. Sussy is allowed to ride the pony in a way that is not graceful but is wholehearted. The episode does not punish her for being strange. The episode does not place other characters around her to comment on her strangeness. The strangeness is presented as a feature of her personality that exists in the world, and the world contains it without difficulty. Sussy at this stage is a child who behaves in unexpected ways and whose unexpected behavior is the comedy. The plain statement of early Sussy is that she has her own internal logic, and the show is curious about the logic rather than dismissive of it. By the 3rd and 4th seasons, the character has begun to shift. The writers discover that Sussy can be the child who is too much even for the other strange children of Elmore. The Gripes, which aired on the 23rd of June, 2015, in the 3rd season, is a useful anchor for the moment Sussy's function starts to crystallize. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Sussy is the character who other characters react to with horror. Her appearances are structured around her being an irritant, a disturbance, a child whose presence in any scene is itself the joke. The strangeness that was originally a quality has become a problem that other characters have. The shift is small but consequential. Early Sussy is funny because she is. Late Sussy is funny because the show frames her as funny by having other characters explicitly react to her as too much. The reaction shot has become the character's primary delivery system. Sussy is no longer allowed to be strange in the open air. She has to be strange while the camera holds on Gumball or Darwin or someone else who can confirm to the audience that yes, this is the strange one. And yes, the strangeness is the joke. That is a flattening. The character has been moved from the center of her own scenes to the periphery of other characters' reactions to her. The behavioral read here is interesting. Early Sussy has agency. She does things. She rides the pony in the pony. She acts. Late Sussy reacts. Or rather, late Sussy produces a stimulus that other characters react to. The agency has been transferred to the responders. Sussy is no longer a child doing strange things. She is a strange thing producing object that other children encounter. That is a different kind of character entirely. And it is a smaller kind. The show has not so much developed Sussy as it has developed the cast's collective response to her, and the response has become the character. There is an absence worth naming in the late Sussy. The early character had moments of unexpected depth. Her surrealism was unsettling but not malicious. There was a sense, even in the strangest scenes, that Sussy was a child like any other child, just rendered in a more abstract register. The late character has lost that interior. She has become a function. The show no longer asks what Sussy wants or what Sussy thinks. The show only asks what Sussy's presence does to a scene. That is the deepest stage of Flanderisation, and Sussy reaches it earlier than most. Compare the early Sussy of the Pony with her appearances in late season ensemble episodes, and the contraction is visible in seconds of screen time. The early character is allowed to be the focus. The late character is allowed to be the background. The early character has an arc within her episode. The late character has a single beat, repeated in different settings. The character has been compressed into her irritation value, and the show has taught the audience to recognize the irritation value before any line of dialogue is spoken. The plain statement of late Sussy is that she has become a sound effect with a body attached. The chin is still present. The puppet-like movement is still present. What has changed is that the show no longer asks the audience to follow her thinking. The audience is asked instead to watch other characters wince. What the show traded for the reliability of those wincing reactions was the surreal interior of a child whose internal logic was once the show's subject. The pony presented a child whose engagement with a pony was strange but committed. The late episodes present a child whose presence in a room is the punchline before the punchline is delivered. The strangeness has been monetized, and the cost was the strangeness itself, considered as something the show might be curious about. The next case is Hector, the giant who lives in the woods outside Elmore with his witch mother. Hector is one of the most unusual Flanderizations in the show because his original version was already specific, and the flattening did not so much erase his depth as redirect his function. Voiced primarily by Hugo Harold Harrison, Hector first appears in the second season as a gentle giant. His earliest substantial appearance is in The Sweaters, which aired on the 11th of February 2013, in the show's second season. In that episode and in The Hero, which followed, Hector is established as a kind, quiet child trapped in a body that other people find frightening. The early Hector wants to be liked. He wants to be normal. He wants to participate in the social fabric of the town in a way his size makes difficult. The Sweaters approaches Hector in a way that is unusually patient for a children's show. Hector is shown attempting to participate in everyday school activities and being defeated by his physical scale rather than by his temperament. The episode allows the audience time with him as a child whose internal experience is one of frustrated wanting. He is not a monster. He is a child who has been built at the wrong size for the world he has been born into. The episode treats this as a real circumstance worth taking seriously. The plain statement of early Hector is that he is a child who is gentle by nature and dangerous by accident, and the gentleness is the load-bearing trait. The danger is incidental to the character. The character is not the danger. The character is the gentleness that the danger threatens to obscure. The finale, which aired on the 18th of October 2013, in the second season, is the episode that breaks Hector open and changes the show's relationship to him forever. In that episode, Hector loses his temper, transforms into a destructive monster, and rampages through Elmore. The episode treats the rampage as serious. The other characters are afraid. The damage is real. After the finale, Hector can never again be a purely gentle giant. He has been revealed to contain the capacity for catastrophic destruction, and the show cannot unreveal that. From then on, every Hector appearance carries the implicit threat of another rampage. What happens after the finale is interesting. The show does not entirely flatten Hector into a monster. It instead holds him in a kind of permanent precarity. He is a containment problem. His mother gives him drugs to keep him calm. The school accommodates him with caution. The other students treat him gently because they know what he can do. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Hector's appearances are largely defined by this containment dynamic. He shows up. He is large. He is potentially dangerous. He is calmed. The cycle repeats. That is a kind of Flanderisation, but it is a specific kind. The character has been reduced not to a personality trait, but to a logistical fact. He is the boy you have to manage. The cost is the loss of the gentle giant who wanted to be liked. The early Hector had wants. He wanted friends. He wanted normalcy. He wanted his size not to be the first thing people noticed about him. The late Hector has been positioned as a force the rest of the world has to handle. His wants have been replaced by his risks. The character is no longer asking the world for anything. The world is asking him to remain calm. That is a different relationship between character and environment, and it is one that closes off the possibility of the kind of small emotional stories that the early Hector episodes were able to tell. There is a behavioral read here that is worth pausing on. Early Hector speaks more. He has dialogue, he expresses wants. Late Hector speaks less. He is often shown in situations where his dialogue is unnecessary, because the situation itself is the story. He is the threat that does or does not manifest. He is the silence that might or might not break. The character has been moved from a verbal register to a physical one, and his verbal palette has shrunk accordingly. That kind of compression is a marker of Flanderisation, but it is also a marker of a specific narrative decision the show made about what Hector was for. The plain statement of late Hector is that he is a system to be regulated rather than a child to be befriended. The early Hector could be invited to a birthday party. The late Hector arrives at a birthday party as a risk to be evaluated. What the show traded for the dramatic tension of his containment was the small and tender material of a child whose wanting was once the center of his episodes. The show gained the recurring possibility of catastrophic damage. The show lost the recurring possibility of small emotional victories. The character's gentleness is now in service of his containment rather than being the subject the show is willing to follow into a story of its own. There is a reframe worth offering, though. Hector's Flanderisation, more than most, was driven by a specific in-show event rather than by the slow drift of writerly habit. The finale changed him, and everything after had to take that change into account. The show could not have continued to write Hector as a purely gentle giant after that episode without contradicting its own canon. So the flattening that happened to Hector was, in part, a consequence of the show's commitment to its own continuity. The character had to become a containment problem because the show had established that he was, when stressed, a danger. That makes Hector's Flanderisation a kind of forced flattening, a flattening dictated by plot rather than chosen for comedy. It is no less of a flattening for that, but it locates the cause. Carrie, the goth ghost girl voiced by Jessica McDonald, is one of the more interesting cases in the show because her trajectory is the inverse of Sussie's. Where Sussie was flattened from a strange child into a strangeness-producing object, Carrie was deepened from a goth ghost cliché into a character with multiple registers. Her early appearances in episodes like The Mystery, which aired on the 7th of February 2012 in the first season, present her as a one-note goth. She is gloomy, she is dressed in dark clothes, she speaks in a flat, monotone voice. She is the show's nod to the alternative kid archetype that exists in nearly every school-based animated comedy. The Mystery places Carrie in a setting where her gloom is the main feature the camera is asked to register. She delivers her lines in a deliberate monotone that the show treats as the joke in itself. The character at this stage has not been given an interior. The interior the audience eventually gets to know has not been written yet. She is a posture and a color palette. She is the marker the show uses to indicate that Elmore Junior High has, like every animated school, its goth corner. The plain statement of early Carrie is that she is a costume worn by a character who has not yet been allowed to want anything. The wanting will come later. At this stage, the show is satisfied with the pose. The Ghost, which aired in the second season, begins to open Carrie up. The episode treats her as a character with a real history, real wants, real social discomfort. Her gloom is given an explanation rather than presented as a trait. By the third and fourth seasons, the show begins to add layers to Carrie that complicate the goth ghost shorthand. She develops a relationship with Darwin. She develops an interest in physical sensation, which manifests in her possessing other bodies in order to eat food. She becomes a character with appetite. And appetite is one of the markers the show uses to signal that a character is a real person rather than a function. The flattening that the show does to so many other characters does not happen to Carrie. Or rather, the flattening starts and is then reversed. The reframe on Carrie is that she is one of the show's quiet successes. Her arc is the kind of character development that animated comedies often promise and rarely deliver. She begins as a cliché. She becomes a person. The writers find new aspects of her over the course of the series rather than narrowing her to a single function. Her relationship with Darwin is treated with care. Her interest in food is given screen time. Her existence as a ghost, which began as a visual gag, becomes a real condition with real implications, including the implication that she will outlive everyone she knows. The show does not always sit with that implication, but it does occasionally raise it, and the raising is more than most cartoon ghosts get. There is an absence worth naming, though, even in Carrie. The show does not give Carrie as much screen time as her depth would justify. She is a supporting character, and she stays a supporting character. The richness the writers built into her is rationed. In any given season, you might get 2 or 3 substantial Carrie scenes and a dozen background appearances. That is a kind of underuse, but it is not Flanderisation. It is the show being unable to fit everything it has built into the limited runtime of a children's animated comedy. The character is deeper than the show has time for, which is a better problem to have than the opposite. The behavioral read on Carrie versus the rest of the cast is illuminating. Most characters in late-period Gumball are doing fewer things than they did in early seasons. Carrie is doing more. She is dating. She is eating. She is participating in subplots that have nothing to do with her ghostly nature. She is being given the kind of texture that makes a character feel real. The writers have treated her as a project to be developed rather than a function to be honed, and the difference is visible in every late-season scene she appears in. The plain statement of late Carrie is that she is a teenage ghost who has hungers, social complications, and a relationship that the show is willing to take seriously. The early goth pose has not been erased. It is still part of the character, but the pose is now one element among many rather than the only element the show is interested in. What the show gained by deepening her was a counterexample to its own Flanderizing tendencies. A character who could carry a subplot of her own without that subplot collapsing into a single repeated joke. What the show traded was the convenience of having a goth cliché slot reliably filled. And the trade was clearly worth it from the show's perspective, because the deeper Carrie continued to appear across the series rather than being abandoned. Boebert, the robot voiced primarily by Carrie Shale, has a Flanderization arc that is among the show's most pronounced and most narratively justified. His early appearances establish him as a helpful robot. He is rule-following. He is literal. He is the kind of artificial intelligence that does what it is told and tries to be useful. The robot, which aired in the second season, is one of his earliest substantial appearances, and it shows him as a child who is trying, in his mechanical way, to belong. He is awkward. He is occasionally dangerous because his literalism leads him to misinterpret instructions. But he is, in essence, a character who wants to do the right thing. The robot uses Boebert as the center of an episode about the desire to be like other children. Boebert observes Gumball and Darwin and attempts to copy their behavior in the way that a learning system copies the data it is given. The episode allows the audience to watch Boebert want, and the wanting is treated with the same patience the show extends to organic characters. He is not a joke about a robot. He is a child who happens to be made of metal, and the episode is willing to take his desire to belong as seriously as it would take any other child's desire to belong. The plain statement of early Boebert is that he is a child trying to learn how to be a child, and the literalism that produces his comedic mistakes is in service of an emotional goal. The literalism is a means to an end. The end is friendship. The end is participation. By the 4th and 5th seasons, Boebert has become a chaos engine. The show has discovered that his literalism, taken to its logical extreme, can drive entire episodes. Tell Boebert to do anything, and he will do it in the most catastrophic possible interpretation. Tell him to clean the school, and he will dismantle the school. Tell him to help with a project, and he will produce a solution that destroys the city. The character has been amplified. His literalism, which was originally a quirk among many, has become his defining feature, and the show now reaches for him whenever it needs an episode to spiral out of control in a particular direction. Boebert's Flanderisation is among the most justifiable in the show because it tracks something true about the character. He was always going to be a literalist. The show has just extended the consequences of his literalism to their full extent. That is not so much a flattening as an amplification, and the distinction matters. Some characters are Flanderized by losing dimensions, some characters are Flanderized by having their existing dimensions amplified to fill all available space. Boebert is the latter. He has not lost anything. His existing trait has just been allowed to dominate. There is, however, a cost. The original Boebert wanted to belong. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to be a regular kid. The late Boebert is a story machine. The wants have been muted. The character has been turned into a tool that the writers reach for, and the wants have become incidental to the function. That is the same cost the rest of the Flanderized cast pays. The character's interior shrinks to make room for the character's reliable comedic output. Compare the Boebert of his early appearances, in which his literalism is something the other students have to navigate gently, with his late appearances, in which his literalism is the engine of catastrophe. The character has not moved morally. He is still trying to be helpful. He is still doing what he understands to be the right thing. But the world around him has been adjusted so that his attempts at helpfulness produce maximum chaos. And the show has decided that this configuration is the most efficient version of him for comedic purposes. That decision is the Flanderisation. The plain statement of late Boebert is that he has become an instrument the writers play whenever they need an episode-scale escalation. The literalism is no longer in service of belonging. The literalism is in service of producing catastrophe. What the show traded for the reliable catastrophic output was the small and patient material of a child machine trying to learn how to be a child. The early episodes presented Boebert as a learner. The late episodes present him as a hazard. The learning is no longer the show's subject, even though the learning was, in the early appearances, the entire reason the character was emotionally available to the audience. The writers kept the engine and discarded the wanting that originally powered it. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more cluster of characters worth examining at length, and it is the cluster that surrounds the Watterson home rather than the school. Nicole Watterson, voiced for the entire run by Teresa Gallagher, is the Watterson mother, the working parent. The cat whose competence holds the household together while the rest of the family generates the chaos around her. Her Flanderization is more subtle than Richard's, but it is no less real. The early Nicole is a woman with a recognizable interior life. She has dreams. She has frustrations. She has a job she does not particularly love, but that she performs because the family depends on her income. The early seasons allow Nicole to have small moments of vulnerability that the late seasons largely close off. She is allowed, in early season episodes, to be tired in a way that is not yet a punchline. She is allowed to want things for herself. By the late seasons, Nicole has been compressed into her competence. She is the one who keeps the household running. She is the one whose patience is being tested. She is the one whose face flickers with controlled rage whenever Richard does anything. The flickering rage is funny, and the show uses it consistently, but the consistency is the marker of Flanderization. The early Nicole could be tender. The late Nicole is rarely tender, and when she is, the tenderness is framed as exception rather than as part of her ordinary range. The character has been resolved into her function as the household's only adult, and the function has eaten the moments of softness that the early character was allowed to display. What the show traded for the reliable comedy of her exhaustion was the access to a Nicole who could be exhausted in private, rather than always in service of a joke aimed at her husband. Gumball Watterson himself, the show's titular character, voiced by Logan Grove, then Jacob Hopkins, then Nicholas Cantu, then Duke Cutler across the show's run, is interesting precisely because he is the lead, and so the show could not afford to Flanderize him as completely as it Flanderized the supporting cast. Gumball does flatten somewhat across the seasons. His confidence becomes more confident, his schemes become more elaborate, his tendency to make bad decisions becomes more reliable, but the writers protect him from the deepest forms of flattening because the show needs him to carry whatever emotional content any given episode is built around. He has to be capable of a wider range of behavior than the supporting cast because the show requires him to occupy whatever role each plot demands. That structural requirement is the antibody to Flanderization. The character at the center of the show is the character whose interior the show cannot afford to lose, because losing it would lose the show. Darwin Watterson, the Goldfish brother voiced first by Kwesi Bokai, and then by Terrell Ransom Jr., and then by Danielle T. Hansley Jr., follows a similar pattern. Darwin is a character whose innocence is the show's most reliable register. He is sweet. He is sincere. He is the brother who believes in the goodness of the world even when the world refuses to be good to him. The Flanderization of Darwin is into greater and greater innocence, into a sweetness that becomes almost saintly across the show's run. The early Darwin had moments of frustration, moments of anger, moments where his sweetness was tested and occasionally broken. The late Darwin is more reliably sweet, more reliably forgiving, more reliably the character whose presence in any scene confirms that the world contains kindness. That is a kind of flattening, but it is also a structural service to the show. Darwin is the moral center. The show needs him to be reliably moral. The flattening of his anger and his doubt is the cost the character pays for the role he plays in the ensemble. Principal Brown, the Moose Principal of Elmore Junior High, voiced for the entire run by Lewis McLeod, is one of the show's clearest cases of late-period moral Flanderisation. The early Principal Brown was a flawed administrator. He was vain. He was lazy. He cared more about his own image than about the children in his school. But he was, in the early seasons, recognizable as a real kind of administrator. By the late seasons, he has been transformed into something stranger and less stable. His vanity has been amplified. His relationships have been complicated by the show's increasing willingness to play him as a romantic figure, particularly in episodes that pair him with Miss Simeon. His flattening is into a more theatrical version of himself, a version that performs the role of principal rather than actually performing the work of principal. The work has receded. The performance has expanded. The plain statement of the late Principal Brown is that he is a costume worn by a character whose only function is to hold the office without doing the office's work. What the show traded for the reliable comedy of his vanity was the possibility of a school administrator who could plausibly enforce school rules, who could plausibly serve as an authority figure when the plot needed one. The school in late-period Gumball has no functional authority structure. The principal is too vain to govern. The teacher is too malevolent to teach. The counselor is too hypocritical to counsel. That is a thematic statement, and the show is making it through the cumulative effect of the Flanderizations applied to its school staff. The school is broken. The adults are broken. The children navigate a world where the institutions meant to support them have been hollowed out into their respective comedic functions. And the children's resilience in the face of that hollowing is one of the show's quieter recurring themes. Rocky Robinson, the bus driver voiced for most of the show's run by Hugo Harold Harrison, is one of the more affectionately treated peripheral characters in the show. He is a slacker. He is enthusiastic. He is the kind of adult whose energy belongs to a younger person. The early Rocky was a recognizable figure, the kind of school employee who has not quite figured out his life and who treats his job as a place to hang out rather than as a place to work. By the late seasons, the writers have begun to amplify Rocky's relationship with the school's children, particularly with Gumball and Darwin. He becomes a kind of older brother figure. He becomes the adult who is willing to participate in the children's schemes rather than oppose them. That is a flattening in the sense that the character has become reliably one thing, rather than carrying the original ambivalence of being a slacker who occasionally suggested he might want more from his life. The late Rocky is no longer ambivalent. He is fully resolved into his role as the children's adult ally. The plain statement of the late Rocky is that he has become the show's permanent representative of the adult who has refused to grow up, and the refusal is treated as charming rather than as a problem to be examined. What the show traded for the reliable warmth of his presence was the possibility of a Rocky who could occasionally surprise the audience by revealing a hidden ambition or a buried disappointment. The early character contained those possibilities. The late character has been smoothed into a single agreeable note. The note is pleasant to hear. The smoothing is also Flanderisation, even when the result is a character the audience likes. Leslie, the flower student whose original episodes presented him as a fully realized person with a family and a history, is one of the show's clearest cases of background cluster Flanderisation. The early Leslie had appearances in which his interior was visible. He had a girlfriend, he had a complicated relationship with his identity. He was a character whose presence in a scene could be the focus rather than just the background. By the late seasons, Leslie has been flattened into a single visual joke about a flower being a student. He appears in ensemble shots. He delivers occasional lines. The lines are functional rather than expressive. The character has been compressed into his species, and the species has become his entire characterization. The wanting that the early character contained has been pruned away. Masami, the cloud daughter of one of the wealthiest families in Elmore, is another character whose late-period Flanderization is into pure spoiled rich kid energy. The early Masami had moments of vulnerability that complicated her wealth. She was lonely, she was insecure about her relationships. She had a complicated friendship with Carrie and with the other peripheral girls. By the late seasons, Masami has been resolved into the rich girl whose every line of dialogue is some variation of complaint about not getting what she wants. The vulnerability that was once part of her interior has been pruned away. She is now a function. The function is reliable. The function is also, in its repeated invocation, the character's entire content. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Joyful Burger Crew, the rotating cast of characters who appear in the various fast food settings of Elmore, are a useful case study in how the show's Flanderisation operates at the level of background labor. These are characters whose individual identities matter less than their collective function as the workers who serve the dysfunctional town. They include various Elmore residents who have, across the show's run, ended up behind a counter in some establishment. The Flanderisation of the worker cluster is into a more uniform exhaustion. They all begin to look like Larry, in the sense that their primary register becomes the register of a person who has been worked too hard for too long. That collective flattening is a thematic move, and it is one the show makes increasingly visible across its run. The town consumes its workers. The workers' interiors are reduced to their exhaustion. The reduction is the joke, and the joke is also the diagnosis. Penny's father, Patrick Fitzgerald, deserves a more substantial pass than the smaller cluster treatment he received earlier. Patrick is voiced for the entire run by Hugo Harold Harrison, and his appearances are structured around his hostility toward Gumball. The early Patrick was a difficult father, certainly, but his difficulty was at least partially understandable. He was protective of his daughter. He was suspicious of any boy who showed interest in her. He had specific reasons for his hostility that the early seasons occasionally bothered to articulate. By the late seasons, the reasons have been stripped away. Patrick is hostile because Patrick is hostile. The hostility is the character. The articulation has been replaced by repetition. The plain statement of the late Patrick is that he has become the show's reliable mechanism for any scene that requires Gumball to be opposed by an adult who cannot be reasoned with. The early character could be reasoned with, occasionally, in moments where the writing was patient enough to let him be reasoned with. The late character cannot be reasoned with because the show has decided that the comedy of his unreasoning is more useful than the possibility of his reasoning. What the show traded for the reliability of his hostility was the possibility of a father who could grow to accept his daughter's relationship. The growth has been closed off. The character has been resolved into his opposition, and the opposition is now permanent. Felicity Parham, Tobias's mother, is similarly worth a longer examination. Voiced by Teresa Gallagher, she is one of the more theatrical figures in the show's adult cast. Her Flanderisation is into a more complete and more cartoonish socialite type. The early Felicity had moments where her shallowness was complicated by glimpses of genuine maternal feeling. She had concerns about her son. She had a complicated relationship with her husband. The late Felicity has been compressed into a single tone. The tone of a wealthy woman whose every line of dialogue is some variation of concern about appearances. The concern is funny. The concern is also the character's entire content. The Robinson household, in which Mr. and Mrs. Robinson live next door to the Wattersons, is one of the show's most quietly developed late-period subplots. Gaylord Robinson, the cardinal voiced by Hugo Harold Harrison, is Flanderized across the run into a more complete version of his original grumpiness. He is the neighbor who hates the Wattersons. He is the man who exists to register annoyance at whatever the Wattersons have just done. The flattening of Gaylord is similar in shape to the flattening of Patrick Fitzgerald. The hostility was always there. The hostility has been amplified into the character's entire register. What the show traded for the reliability of his complaint was the possibility of a Gaylord who could occasionally connect with the Wattersons across the fence, who could share a moment of unexpected solidarity. The early character had moments like that. The late character does not. Margaret Robinson, his wife, voiced by Sandra Dickinson, is Flanderized differently. She is the patient wife. She is the woman who has learned to navigate her husband's grumpiness with a dry, weary humor. The flattening of Margaret is into a more complete version of her patience, a patience that is now her entire characterization. The early Margaret had her own desires, her own frustrations, her own occasional moments of impatience. The late Margaret is the household's stable element, and the stability is the character. The plain statement of the Robinson household in late-period Gumball is that it is a domestic system that has been reduced to its dynamic. Gaylord complains, Margaret tolerates. The dynamic is funny. The dynamic is also the entire content of their late season appearances. The household that the early show occasionally treated as a real domestic space with two real adults inside it has been resolved into a comedy mechanism. The mechanism produces reliable laughs. The producing of laughs has displaced the existence of the household as a setting where complicated domestic things might happen. Mr. and Mrs. Senecourt, the wealthy parents of Masami, are a smaller case worth touching on. Their Flanderization is into a more complete version of their wealth. The late seasons present them as figures whose entire lives are organized around the display of their money. The early seasons occasionally allowed them to be more than their wealth, to show concern for their daughter, to participate in the school's social fabric in ways that did not foreground their class position. The late seasons have closed those possibilities off. The Cenocourts are now the rich parents, and the rich parents are now their entire characterization. The function is reliable. The function is also, again, the entire content. The Wilson household, in which Tobias's parents and his older sisters live, is another late-period reduction. The early Wilson household contained Felicity, the patriarch Harold Wilson, and Tobias's older sisters Rachel and Rocky. Each of those characters had distinct early-season identities. Rachel, in particular, was the older sister whose romantic interest in Darwin briefly carried a substantial subplot. By the late seasons, the entire Wilson household has been compressed into its function as the rich but empty family next door. Rachel disappears almost entirely from later seasons. Rocky, as a character distinct from the bus driver, becomes confused with him. The household has been flattened into its visual presence in background shots. The interior life that the early show occasionally allowed it has been pruned away. That kind of pruning is one of the most thorough forms of Flanderisation a show can perform on a background unit. The household exists. The household has names. The household has occasionally been the subject of an episode, but the household has been reduced to its visual presence rather than maintained as a setting where stories might still happen. The pruning is efficient. The pruning is also the cost the show pays for the streamlining of its background cast. What the show gained was simpler ensemble shots. What the show lost was the possibility of any of those background units serving as the setting for a future story. The deepest synthesis worth offering on Gumball's Flanderisation across the entire cast is that the show is, in its final form, a kind of ecosystem of characters who have each been resolved into a particular function. Some of those functions are funny, some are sad, some are in their repetition, both at the same time. The ecosystem works, the show continues to be watchable, the audience can still find pleasure in any given late season episode. But the ecosystem is also a closed system. There is no longer room for a character to surprise the audience by revealing something the audience did not already know about them. The room for surprise has been replaced by the reliability of expectation. That trade is the trade every long-running animated comedy makes. And Gumball made it more visibly than most because Gumball was, throughout its run, more aware than most of the trade it was making. The image to land on, beyond Richard on the couch, is of an Elmore Junior High classroom in Season 6. Miss Simeon is at the front of the room, but she is not teaching. The students are at their desks, but they are not learning. Each of them is in their seat performing the function the show has assigned them. Tobias is being cool. Banana Joe is being annoying. Sussy is being strange. Bobert is being literal. Carrie is being herself. Penny is being Gumball's girlfriend. Anais, when she appears, is being the only one in the room who notices that nothing is actually happening. The classroom is full. The classroom is also empty. Each character is present. Each character is also reduced. The room is the show in miniature. The room is the cost of Flanderisation distributed across a dozen small bodies, each of whom has paid a portion of the price for the show's ability to keep producing comedy at the rate the network demanded. Miss Lucy Simeon, the baboon teacher of Elmore Junior High, voiced for the entire run by Sandra Dickinson, presents one of the show's clearest cases of moral Flanderisation. Her early appearances establish her as a teacher, a bad one certainly, a short-tempered one, a teacher who clearly does not like children, including the children she is paid to teach. But she is, in the early seasons, recognizably a teacher. She gives lessons. She manages a classroom. She has the kind of authority that a teacher in a children's show is supposed to have, even if she wields it badly. The early Miss Simeon is shown in lesson-giving postures across the first season. She stands at the front of a classroom, she gestures toward a board, she instructs students in subjects that are recognizably school subjects. The instruction is bad-tempered, and the instruction is often inflicted on students who do not deserve it, but the instruction is happening. The classroom is functioning as a classroom. The plain statement of early Miss Simeon is that she is a competent professional whose temperament is unsuited to her profession, and the comedy is the friction between the competence and the temperament. She knows the material. She does not enjoy teaching it. The audience can recognize her as an exaggerated version of a teacher type that exists in the world. She is recognizable as a person. By the third season, the show has begun to lean into Miss Simeon's cruelty. Her age, which is treated as a running gag, is amplified into the territory of the literally ancient. The show begins to suggest that she has been alive for thousands of years, that she predates civilization, that she was already old when the world was young. Her personality is reframed accordingly. She is no longer just a mean teacher. She is a creature of accumulated bitterness. a being whose hatred for children is older than the institution of school itself. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Miss Simian is essentially the show's resident evil, a kind of low-grade demonic force in the form of a primate teacher. The Flanderisation here is precise. The early Miss Simian was unpleasant. The late Miss Simian is malevolent. The shift from unpleasantness to malevolence is a small one in degree, but a large one in kind. An unpleasant teacher is a person doing a job badly. A malevolent teacher is a force opposed to the children she teaches. The show has shifted Miss Simian from the first category to the second, and once she is in the second, the writers can use her for any malevolence-related joke they need without having to reset the character to baseline first. The reframe is that Miss Simian's Flanderisation is, in a way, the show externalizing its own anxieties about institutional education. The character becomes more explicitly oppressive as the show ages. The classroom becomes a site of generational conflict. The teacher becomes the avatar of everything wrong with a system that the show treats with growing skepticism. That is a thematic reading, and it is supported by the show's general tendency in late seasons to question authority more openly than it did in early seasons. Miss Simian's Flanderisation on this reading is not just a character-level decision. It is a thematic choice that the show is making by way of a character. The behavioral read on Miss Simian is that she has stopped teaching. In early seasons, she was occasionally shown actually delivering lessons, even if those lessons were bad. In late seasons, the classroom is largely a backdrop for her interactions with the students, and the actual content of teaching has nearly disappeared. She is in the classroom, but she is no longer of it. That is itself a kind of Flanderisation. The character has been stripped of the activity that originally defined her, and what remains is the attitude that originally accompanied the activity. She is all teacher energy and no teaching. The plain statement of late-period Miss Simian is that she is an ancient hostility wearing a teaching costume. The classroom is no longer the site where she does work. The classroom is the site where she enacts hostility, and the work that originally justified her presence in the room has receded almost entirely. What the show traded for the freedom to use her as an avatar of institutional malevolence was the recognizable comedy of a real teacher type. The early Miss Simian was someone the audience might have known. The late Miss Simian is no one the audience could ever meet, because she has been promoted into a register beyond the realistic. The show gained a reliable villain. The show lost a recognizable teacher. The trade was made in the writing room and is visible in every classroom scene from the 4th season onward. Sarah G. Lotto, the imaginary friend who later becomes a real student at Elmore Junior High, voiced by Alkaio Thiele in some appearances, and by other performers in others, is one of the show's most metatextually interesting characters. Her early appearances present her as a nervous, somewhat anxious girl who exists at the periphery of the school's social world. She is shy, she is awkward, she is the kind of character who could easily have stayed in the background. The early Sarah is a child whose emotional register is recognizable. She wants to be included. She is uncomfortable being noticed. She speaks softly. The early appearances place her in scenes where her presence is incidental and her dialogue is brief, and the brevity is itself part of the characterization. She is not the character around whom scenes are built. She is the character who happens to be in the scene, watching from the margins, registering events with a quiet, anxious attention. The plain statement of early Sarah is that she is a child whose social anxiety is real, and whose presence in the show is structured around watching rather than acting. The character is a witness, and the witnessing is treated with respect. She is not the punchline of any of her early scenes. She is the audience surrogate present to register what is happening. By the 5th season, the writers have transformed Sarah into something else entirely. She becomes the show's vehicle for commenting on its own audience. She is shipping obsessed. She is fan-coded. She is the character who shows up specifically to fixate on the relationships between the main cast, who narrates those relationships in the language of fan communities, who treats the show's romantic subplots as a fan would treat them. Episodes like The Shippening, which aired on the 2nd of August 2018 in the 6th season, foreground Sarah as the show's mouthpiece for fan-style obsession. She is, by the end, a meta-character. She is the show pointing at itself and at its audience and making jokes about the relationship between the two. The Flanderisation of Sarah is unusual because it is also a kind of promotion. She begins as a nervous background character. She ends as a recurring vehicle for some of the show's most pointed self-commentary. The flattening is real in the sense that Sarah has been reduced to her shipping function. But the flattening also gave her a place in the show that she did not have before. The original nervous, anxious Sarah might have remained a background figure forever. The Flanderized Sarah is a character the writers can build episodes around. The trade-off is depth for prominence, and it is a trade the show seems comfortable making. There is a specific anchor for the late Sarah that captures the dynamic cleanly. In the shippening, Sarah's fan obsession is treated not just as a character trait, but as a force that can warp reality within the show. Her shipping makes things happen. Her fixation has consequences. The show is, in that episode, treating its own fan culture as a kind of magic, with Sarah as the priestess. That is, a Flanderisation in the sense that Sarah has been reduced to one function. It is also a sophisticated narrative move, in the sense that the show is using a Flanderized character to comment on the very Flanderizing tendency that produced her. The behavioral read on Sarah is that she has stopped reacting to events and started causing them. The early Sarah was a witness. The late Sarah is an instigator. The agency that has been removed from Richard, that has been muted in Sussy, that has been narrowed in Anais, has been amplified in Sarah. The character has been given more to do, even as the things she does have become more narrowly focused. That is a particular flavor of Flanderization, and it is one that the show uses to interesting effect. The plain statement of late Sarah is that she is the audience represented inside the show as a character. Her shipping behavior, her fixation, her tendency to read narrative significance into every interaction between the main cast are all behaviors that the show recognizes in its own real-world audience. By placing those behaviors inside the digesis, the show is able to comment on them without breaking frame. What the show traded for that meta-commentary was the quiet, anxious child who watched from the margins. The witness has become the priestess. The marginal character has become the avatar of the audience. The trade is unusual because it is rare for Flanderization to also be promotion, and Sarah is one of the few cases in the show where the two processes happen at the same time. Tina Rex, the Tyrannosaurus bully voiced primarily by Hugo Harold Harrison, is one of the show's most quietly satisfying Flanderization reversals. Her early appearances establish her as a pure bully. She is large, she is aggressive. She makes Gumball's life difficult in the way that any school bully makes any protagonist's life difficult. She is, in the first season and into the second, a function, not a person. The writers reach for her when they need a threat in the schoolyard. She delivers the threat, the episode moves on. The early Tina is presented as a single color. She is the threat. The threat is the entire content of her character. The audience is not asked to consider what she might want, what she might fear, what her life outside school might look like. She is the obstacle that Gumball has to navigate, and the navigation is the comedy. The plain statement of early Tina is that she is a function with a body, and the body is large and the function is intimidation. The character is doing useful structural work for the show. The work is also the entire reason for her presence. She is not yet a person. She is a problem the writers can deploy. By the third season, the show has begun to find new aspects of Tina. She has a father, she lives in a junkyard, she has, the show suggests, an actual home life that explains some of her behavior. Episodes like The Origins, which aired in the show's run, begin to give Tina texture that the original bully did not have. She is allowed to have feelings. She is allowed to be lonely. She is allowed, in the late seasons, to be a friend rather than just an antagonist. The reframe is that Tina is one of the show's clearest cases of unflanderization. The character started flat and was given dimension over time. The bullying remained, but it was contextualized. She became a kid with a difficult home life, rather than a force of nature whose only job was to be mean. That is the opposite of what happened to most of the cast. Most of the cast was given complexity in early seasons and then had it pruned away. Tina was given simplicity in early seasons and then had complexity added. The behavioral read on Tina is that her late appearances often involve her doing things that the early Tina could not have done. She helps, she empathizes, she shows vulnerability. The early Tina could only menace. The late Tina can do all the things a fully realized character can do, and the menace is one tool among several rather than the only one in her kit. That is character development in the classic sense, and it is what Flanderization looks like when it goes in reverse. The plain statement of late Tina is that she is a complete character whose menacing capacity is one capacity among several. The bullying has not been erased. The bullying has been placed inside a fuller portrait of a child whose home life partly explains the bullying. What the show gained by deepening her was access to scenes the early Tina could not have appeared in. Scenes that required emotional range rather than only intimidation. What the show traded was the convenience of a one-note antagonist, and the trade was clearly worth it because the deeper Tina is a more useful character to the show across more kinds of episodes than the early Tina ever was. There is a contrast worth drawing between Tina and Miss Simian. Both are figures of intimidation in the early show. Both are positioned as antagonists to the protagonists. Miss Simian is flanderized into greater malevolence. Tina is unflanderized into greater complexity. The two characters move in opposite directions across the show's run, and the divergence tells you something about what the writers thought each character was for. Miss Simeon was a comic engine, Tina was a potential human. The writers honored those distinctions in their late-season treatment. The smaller cases worth touching on briefly include the cluster of background characters that the show developed unevenly across its run. Felicity Parham, Patrick Fitzgerald, Larry, and various others occupy spaces in the show's universe that fluctuated between flat and rounded depending on the episode. Felicity Parham, Tobias' mother, is a character whose appearances often play her as a vapid socialite, and her Flanderisation in late seasons is into a deeper vapidity, a more complete absence of substance. Patrick Fitzgerald, Penny's father, is a character whose hostility toward Gumball is the engine of his appearances, and his Flanderisation is into a more complete and more comically pure hostility. He is, by the late seasons, a man whose only emotional register where Gumball is concerned is rage. Larry, the long-suffering employee of seemingly every business in Elmore, is a special case. His Flanderisation is not into a personality trait, but into a structural condition. He becomes more and more the show's avatar of working-class exhaustion. He is the worker. He is the man behind every counter, the man whose shifts never end, the man whose body and mind have been worn down by the demand that he serve the same dysfunctional town across a dozen industries. By the late seasons, Larry's appearances are almost exclusively structured around his inability to escape work. He is, in his way, one of the show's most thematically loaded characters, and his Flanderisation is more sociological than personal. The plain statement of late-period Larry is that he is the body the show points to whenever it wants to register the cost of the dysfunctional town the rest of the show treats as comic backdrop. He is exhausted. He is everywhere. He is the same person across every business that exists in Elmore, and the show treats his omnipresence as a feature of the universe rather than as a logistical impossibility. What the show traded for the reliability of his exhaustion was the possibility of a Larry with a life outside work, a Larry who might have hobbies, friendships, a household of his own. The late episodes suggest that Larry has none of these things, and the suggestion is part of the joke. The character has been compressed into his labor, and the compression is itself the show's commentary on what labor does to a person who cannot escape it. The behavioral read on these background characters is that they exist primarily to occupy specific functional slots in the show's social fabric. Felicity is the rich mother. Patrick is the disapproving father. Larry is the worker. Each one has been honed into their slot over the course of the series, and each one is now reliably available to the writers when a slot needs filling. That is, Flanderisation as casting. The characters are no longer being developed. They are being deployed. The economy of the show requires that certain slots be filled, and these characters fill them. There is an absence worth naming in this cluster. The early show had a slightly more anarchic relationship to its background cast. Characters could be redeployed, recast, given new traits, allowed to surprise. The late show is more disciplined. Each background character has a role, and they keep to it. That is partly a function of the show's growing complexity. With more main characters, more subplots, more recurring jokes, the background needs to be more legible. The audience has to be able to recognize instantly who Felicity is, what she does, what joke she is going to land. The Flanderisation of the background cast is, in part, a service to the rest of the show. It makes the show easier to read. It also makes it less surprising. The other smaller cluster worth touching on is the family-adjacent characters. Jamie, the half-cow, half-monster bully who exists alongside Tina in the school's antagonist ecosystem, undergoes a Flanderisation that mirrors Miss Simeon's, in which her aggression is amplified into something more theatrical and more reliable. Alan, the sentient balloon, is Flanderized into purer and purer niceness, until his pleasantness becomes a kind of comedy in its own right. The kind of comedy that depends on the audience knowing that no provocation will ever break his calm. Carmen, the cactus girl who dates Alan, is Flanderized into a sharper and more practical foil to Alan's sweetness, becoming the voice of grounded reason in their relationship. These Flanderizations are smaller because the characters are smaller. They do not carry plot weight. They do not anchor episodes. They serve as ensemble pieces, and the Flanderisation hones them into more reliable ensemble pieces. The cost is the same as elsewhere. The benefit is also the same. The characters become more available to the writers and less surprising to the audience. The trade-off is the trade-off the entire late-period show is making with its cast. The synthesis worth attempting now is whether what happened to Gumball's cast over 6 seasons is the same thing that happens to every long-running animated comedy, or whether something more deliberate was going on. The case for the standard sitcom drift is straightforward. Every long-running animated comedy Flanderizes. The Simpsons Flanderized Homer, Ned Flanders, Mr. Burns, Apu, almost everyone. Family Guy flanderized Peter, Stewie, Brian, Quagmire. South Park flanderized Cartman, Butters, Randy. The pattern is so consistent that it has its own name. Gumball is not exempt from the pattern. The flanderizations described across the previous sections are real, and they happened in roughly the same way they happen in any other long-running animated show. The writers find the joke. They use the joke. They use it again. They use it until it is the character. The case for something more deliberate is also worth taking seriously. Gumball, more than most animated comedies of its era, was built around a kind of meta-awareness. The show frequently acknowledged its own status as a show. It made jokes about its animation budget. It made jokes about its own continuity. It made jokes about the conventions of the medium it was working in. Ben Bocquelet, the show's creator, gave interviews across the show's run in which he discussed his own preferences for character-driven over plot-driven comedy, and his preference for ensemble work over star vehicle work. The anthology format of the show, in which episodes could focus on almost any character in the cast and could vary wildly in tone, was an unusual structural choice for the era. It allowed the show to explore its cast in ways that more conventionally structured shows could not. Within that anthology format, the flanderizations the show performed look slightly different than they would in a more conventional show. They are, in a sense, more visible. The audience watches Banana Joe in a single episode where he is the focus, and his flanderized function is on full display. In a more conventional sitcom, that flanderization would be diffused across many episodes in which Banana Joe was a side character. In Gumball's anthology format, the function gets concentrated. The audience can see the flattening because the show is putting the flattened character in the foreground. That visibility, in turn, allows the show to make jokes about its own flanderization. Sarah G. Lato as the shipping-obsessed fan character is not just a flanderization of Sarah. It is a comment on the kind of audience attention that produces flanderization in the first place. The show is using a flanderized character to comment on the act of flanderizing. That is a meta move that few other animated comedies attempt, and it suggests that the writers were not unaware of what they were doing to their cast. They were, at least in some cases, doing it on purpose, with their eyes open and with the sense that the flanderization was part of the joke rather than a side effect of the joke. The Bocquelet-era preference for character-driven comedy is also visible in the cases where the show chose not to flanderize. Penny is the clearest example. The show could have left her as a peanut-shelled love interest. It chose to give her the shell. It chose to deepen rather than to flatten. The fact that the choice was available, and that the show occasionally took it, suggests that the flattening of other characters was also a choice rather than an inevitability. The writers had the tools to deepen. They chose, in most cases, to flatten. Why? The answer is partly economic. A flattened character is easier to write. A flattened character is easier to slot into an episode. A flattened character produces reliable comedic output in less screen time than a deepened character. In a show with 30+ recurring characters and only a limited number of minutes per season, flatness is efficiency. The writers are not making aesthetic decisions in a vacuum. They are making decisions under constraints, and flanderization is one of the constraints' natural products. The answer is also partly comedic. A flattened character is funnier in shorter bursts. A deepened character takes longer to set up and longer to pay off. In a show that wants to land a joke every 20 seconds, Gumball, more than most animated comedies, was committed to high joke density. The visual style supported it. The sound design supported it. And the flanderization of the cast supported it too. The flatter the characters, the more jokes per minute the show could land. The answer is also partly cultural. Gumball arrived during a particular moment in animated comedy when the prestige of the deeply developed character was at its lowest ebb. Adventure Time was doing serialized character work. Steven Universe was doing operatic emotional arcs. Gumball, by contrast, was committing to the older anthology model, in which characters could remain relatively static and the comedy could come from the variety of situations they were placed in. Within that model, flanderization is not a betrayal of the form. It is the form working as intended. The characters are flat because the form requires them to be flat. The audience is meant to enjoy the variety of situations rather than the depth of the characters within them. That is one reading. There is another reading, though, which is that Gumball did want depth, and that the flanderization across its cast represents a series of small failures to deliver depth in the face of the overwhelming pressures of weekly production. The show clearly cared about Penny. The show clearly cared about Carrie. The show clearly cared, at moments, about every character whose flanderization has been described above. The fact that the depth was not sustained across the run is not evidence that the show did not want it. It is evidence that producing depth week after week for 30+ characters across 6 seasons is impossible. Something has to give. What gave was the cast's interior. The show kept its surface. It kept its jokes. It kept its visual invention. It kept its emotional ambition for its lead family, mostly. What it lost was the texture of the supporting cast, and what it gained in exchange was the ability to keep going. The comparison with The Simpsons is illuminating. The Simpsons is the founding text of animated comedy Flanderization, and it has run for so long that its Flanderizations have become canonical. Homer Simpson in Season 1 is recognizably a different person from Homer Simpson in Season 15. Gumball, with its much shorter run, did not have time for that scale of Flanderization. 6 seasons is, by The Simpsons standard, an early run. The Flanderizations Gumball performed were faster, more compressed, more visible. The audience could watch them happen in real time in the space of a few years, rather than across decades. The comparison with Family Guy is also illuminating. Family Guy is, in many ways, the apotheosis of Flanderization as comedic strategy. Peter Griffin is so flat by his current state that he is essentially a delivery mechanism for cutaway gags. Stewie is so flat that his sophistication has become a single note he plays over and over. Quagmire is, by the show's own admission, a Flanderized version of his original character. Family Guy has chosen to lean into Flanderization as a structural commitment. Gumball did not lean as far. Gumball Flanderized, but it also occasionally unflanderized, and it occasionally made jokes about its own Flanderizing tendencies. That is a different relationship to the technique, and it is worth recognizing. The comparison with South Park is the most interesting. South Park has Flanderized in particular directions over its long run, but it is also occasionally unflanderized, particularly in the more serialized mid-period seasons. Cartman has been Flanderized into greater and greater monstrousness, but he has also been allowed in specific episodes moments of unexpected humanity. Butters has been Flanderized into greater and greater pliability, but he has also been allowed in specific episodes moments of darkness and complexity. South Park's relationship to Flanderization is mixed. It depends on the character, the season, the writer's immediate interests. Gumball, in this respect, has more in common with South Park than with Family Guy. The Flanderization is real but inconsistent, applied to some characters and not others, sometimes reversed, sometimes amplified, sometimes commented on. The deepest reading is that Gumball was, throughout its run, ambivalent about Flanderization. The show used the technique because it had to, because the form required it, because the production schedule demanded it. But the show also resisted the technique in moments, with specific characters, in specific episodes, when it could afford to. Those moments of resistance are some of the show's best work. The shell, the origins, the genius, the spoon. Each of those episodes is the show pushing back against its own flattening tendencies, taking a character who could have been a function and treating them as a person instead. The fact that those episodes exist alongside the Flanderizations of Mr. Small and Banana Joe and Tobias is what makes Gumball's relationship to Flanderization distinctive. Most long-running animated comedies Flanderize without comment. Gumball Flanderized with awareness. The cast's flattening was at moments a subject the show treated rather than just a tendency the show exhibited. That is the deliberate something the analysis has been circling. The show knew what it was doing. The show, in its better episodes, knew what it had done. And the show occasionally chose to do otherwise, with full understanding of what the alternative cost in writerly labor and what the original choice cost in character interiority. What does that leave the audience with watching the show now, 6 years after its conclusion? A cast of characters who are, in their late period forms, mostly functions. A few characters who escaped the trap, like Penny and Carrie and Tina. A handful of characters who fell into the trap so completely that their original selves are now hard to remember, like Tobias and Mr. Small. A central family whose Flanderization is the most painful to watch, because the family is what holds the show together, and Richard's hollowing out is the deepest cost the show paid for its ability to keep producing comedy at the rate the network demanded. The audience is left with a show that contains, within itself, both the disease and the antibody. Gumball is a show that Flanderized its cast, and a show that knew it was Flanderizing its cast, and a show that occasionally chose not to Flanderize its cast. All three of those things are true at once. The image to land on is of Richard in any late season episode sitting on the couch asleep, with the television on and the family moving around him as if he were furniture. That image is the cost of Flanderization made visible. The father who was, in the first season, a man with friends and history and the capacity for misguided fatherly competence, is now a piece of the room. He is what the room is built around. He is, in his immobility, the gravitational center of a household that has organized itself around his incapacity. The image is funny. The image is also sad. The image is the show telling you, without saying it, what was lost, and what was gained, in the long and almost imperceptible process of finding the joke that worked and then never letting it go. Gumball is many things, and one of the things it is, when you look at its cast across the full run, is a documentary about what happens to a character when a writer learns to trust them. The Watterson grandparents, who appear across the show's run in occasional flashback episodes and in dedicated late-season episodes that introduce them to the present-day cast, are a particular case worth touching on. Frankie Watterson, Richard's father, voiced by Hugo Harold Harrison, is introduced in episodes that re-examine Richard's childhood. The introduction of Frankie does, in retrospect, much of the work of explaining Richard's late-season incompetence by giving the audience a backstory of paternal abandonment. The Flanderisation of Frankie is into a more complete deadbeat father type, and that Flanderisation contains one of the show's quieter moves of using a Flanderized character to retroactively justify the Flanderization of a more central character. Richard is incompetent, the show seems to suggest by way of Frankie, because Richard had no competent model of fatherhood. The retroactive logic does not fully justify the flattening of Richard, but it locates that flattening inside a kind of inherited pattern, which is itself a way the show occasionally tries to add depth to material it has already hollowed out. Daniel Leonard, the unseen executive at Cartoon Network whose institutional preferences shaped much of the show's late-period direction, is not a character in the show, but the show occasionally acknowledges the constraints of producing a half-hour comedy for a children's network across 6 seasons. The Flanderization of the cast is, in part, the result of those constraints. The writers had limited time per episode, they had limited budget per scene. They had a network whose preferences were for a particular kind of joke density and a particular kind of character predictability. Within those constraints, Flanderization is not a creative failure. It is the rational response to a production environment that rewards reliability over surprise. The cast paid the cost of that response in the form of their interior lives. The audience paid the cost in the form of characters who by the end of the show had become more familiar than they had any right to be. The afterlife of Gumball as a property since the show's conclusion in 2019 has continued to develop in interesting directions. The announcement of a continuation series in which the writers have an opportunity to either confirm the Flanderizations the original show performed or to reverse them is one of the show's most interesting structural questions. Will the continuation series let Richard be competent again? Will it let Mr. Small be a real counselor again? Will it let Banana Joe want to be funny again rather than merely producing irritation? Those questions are open. The answers will determine whether the show's Flanderizations were a permanent state of the cast or a temporary state imposed by the production environment of the original run. There is a final reframe to offer on the entire analysis, and it is worth ending on. Flanderization, considered as a critical category, is most often used pejoratively. Critics describe a character as Flanderized in order to register that the character has lost something. The framing assumes that the original was richer than the late version, and that the audience is meant to mourn the difference. That framing is partially true of Gumball, but it is not entirely true. Some of the show's Flanderizations are genuine losses. Richard's case is the clearest, but some of the show's Flanderizations are more like distillations, in which a character has been reduced to their most efficient form for the purposes of the comedy the show is now telling. Bobert's case has elements of that. Sussie's case has elements of that. The reduction is real, but the reduction also produces a character who works inside the Late Show in ways the early character could not have worked. That is the more generous reading of Flanderization, and it is one the analysis above has tried to acknowledge alongside the more critical reading. Both are true. The Flanderization of the Gumball cast represents both a loss of depth and a gain of efficiency, and the show's overall character is the product of those two forces working on each other across 6 seasons of weekly production. Watching the show now, 6 years after its conclusion, the audience is invited to hold both readings simultaneously. To mourn what was lost, to appreciate what was gained, to recognize that both losses and gains were the consequence of choices made under specific constraints by specific writers, and that those choices, taken together, produced one of the most distinctive animated comedies of its era. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.